Well, good morning from St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here, and it is my joy to welcome you to the forum where each week we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. This week here at St. Bart's, we had a Trans Day of Remembrance memorial that we offered for, I think, the 5th year in partnership with an organization called Trans-Latinx. As we remember all the trans and non-binary people that have died over the past year, we're talking this morning about trans justice with Aaron Scott, who is the relatively new staff officer for gender justice at the Episcopal Church. So that's a denomination-wide position across the whole Episcopal Church. Before taking this position, Aaron worked in areas of economic justice with the Poor People's Campaign and co-founded an organization in the Pacific Northwest called Chaplains on the Harbor. Aaron has a book coming out in early January, which is called Bring Back Your People, 10 Ways Regular Folks Can Put a Dent in White Christian Nationalism, a very topical book for this moment and for the discussion that we're having today. Aaron, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank all of you at St. Bart's. I especially want to thank, she's not here, but thank Canon Spellers for introducing me to both Reverend Peter and Reverend Zach, and to them for the events that they pulled together for this week, including your partnership with Trans-Latinx. I don't think I need to underscore too much how important that work is, always, but especially right now. So thank you all. I think I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'll jump right into the presentation part. Like Reverend Peter said, my name is Aaron. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the new staff officer for gender justice for the presiding bishop's office. So my role is to support all LGBTQ plus and women's ministries church-wide, which is not a one-person job. That's why I'm here, is to recruit. And I've been in that role since May. I'm the first person in that role. I'm trans, I'm a single parent, I'm a lay person, I'm a Bible scholar. I'm also a second-generation preacher and a third-generation organizer of the poor and working class. And before I had this job, like Reverend Peter said, for about 10 years, I worked at the furthest possible fringes of the institutional church, quite happily. I was doing street and jail ministry in a rural, poor, predominantly white county on the coast of Washington state, where I live. And part of our work there was counter-recruitment from white supremacist street and prison gangs. So that background is how I come into this conversation, how I come into my understanding of what it means to organize and do ministry in defense of trans justice and justice for all people. And I think to start, I want to give us some context for the current crisis we find ourselves in. So globally, right now, the research shows that anywhere between like 39% and 72% of the world's population is living under authoritarian regimes. That does not yet include the United States. And I think it's important for us to understand just how big a role white Christian nationalism plays in the rise of authoritarian movements globally, and understand first we are a global church, and so we need to have that perspective, and we need to be thinking about our sister churches, and also just understanding this is not an issue that is specific to the United States. And you really don't find an authoritarian regime, particularly of the white Christian nationalist variety, that isn't like laser focused on infringing on people's bodily autonomy and controlling people's bodies. And that's actually quite an old script from an old playbook about failing, embattled empires, right? Trying to hold on to power with a death grip. You can go back as far as the late Roman Empire to find evidence of this. It wasn't until Rome was so overstretched by imperial aggression and wars abroad that they started passing at home restrictive marriage legislation, which may sound familiar. And it did this as an attempt at population control, to make sure that the quote-unquote right kind of people kept making babies for the empire, and that the quote-unquote wrong kind of people, be damned. So when we talk about rising violence against trans and non-binary people, whether that's policy violence or social and interpersonal violence, I think we need to keep that context and that long history in mind. In this country, trans people have always been scapegoated to varying degrees, but that scapegoating becomes much more acute in moments like this, when we are considered to be in the way of this imperial order trying to maintain its control of populations, its control of reproduction, and its control of the narrative, right, about who matters, who deserves life and dignity. For me, in this way, that's why I see our struggle as trans people as really inseparable from the struggle for reproductive justice, the struggle against sexual violence and domestic violence, the struggle against police brutality and state violence, and really any struggle and any community that is seeking to assert people's right to live safely in our own bodies. So this year, you may have heard some of these stats in your other events this week for Trans Day of Remembrance. This year alone, as of this morning, there have been at least 665 anti-transgender bills introduced into various American legislative bodies. So that's at the state level, it's at the federal level. You can go to trans-media for their legislation tracker, which breaks it down state by state. And you should know that those 665 bills in this year does not even include the state of Texas, because Texas meets on a 2-year cycle. And the majority of those bills, the majority of those 665 bills, target minors. They target trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming children and youth, because they're focused on bans on gender-affirming care, bans on participation in school sports, book bans, bathroom bans, lots of school-based stuff. The impact of that legislation is really quite violent and deadly for young people. So in September of this year, the Trevor Project released the findings of their peer-reviewed study, and they found that in states where just one of those proposed bills passed, suicide attempts among trans and non-binary youth rose from 7% to 72%, with just one of those bills passing. And even in states where this legislation is not passing, where it's being shot down, trans and non-binary young people and adults are watching the momentum build in various counties across their state, in other states, building at the federal level, and that has a really abysmal impact on mental health. I would say the good news is that these bills, these 665 bills, overwhelmingly have not passed because they are not popular. It is not actually a broad-based, widely supported movement. But we need to take seriously the fact that it takes a lot of coordination, funding, depth, and reach for the networks that are pushing this legislation forward and flooding all of these legislative bodies to do that at this scale and scope. The the white Christian nationalist networks that are behind this orchestrated legal attack know that they're not actually going to win most of these fights on the first time. They know that. That's not their concern. They're building up leaders and candidates and growing their networks for the long term with these local battles and then taking them to the state and then to the national level. So they're not even that interested in swaying the majority of people because they don't particularly care about majority rule. They don't. They have the resources on hand to be able to experiment kind of as much as they want with these local campaigns. And there's no place that's like too small or too unimportant to be considered for this kind of takeover. So an example that I can share is in the summer of 2023, I was in rural Oregon doing a presentation on this stuff, and local LGBTQ plus organizers there were asking a lot of questions about what could they possibly do because they had no capacity, not in terms of people, not in terms of funding, to contend with this barrage of far-right, out-of-state networks that had gotten involved in and started funneling millions of dollars into their local school board elections in towns that, like, the vast majority of Americans have never even heard of, let alone considered, bothering with in terms of trans justice. And so all of this background, all of this legislation, all of these sort of, takeovers of political power, all of this has happened under a Biden presidency. So when we think about what is coming, I think it's important when you're thinking about trans justice to really be preparing for escalation. Some of you may be familiar with Project 2025. It's this blueprint put out for year one of the next presidency. It's laid out by the Heritage Foundation, and it very explicitly characterizes trans people as predators, as sexual predators, as people who should be criminalized because of our bodies, as people who are a threat to children. And it calls really in detailed ways for the criminalization of our access to care for our children, and access, to have the things we need to be safe and alive. And the rhetoric in it is quite violent. I won't read any of it here because it's just, you want to make sure you're in a place where you're ready for that. But if you have the bandwidth, you should at least take a look at some of the main points in there, because these are people who do what they say they are going to do. I think we also need to be thinking longer than 4 years. I think we need to be thinking generationally about the work ahead of us. And I think when it comes to trans justice, but also many kinds of justice, I think we need to be preparing for a moment where some of our organizing and ministry may have to start going under the radar. We're already seeing significant rises in the violent murders of trans people this year. So some of that is due to more accurate reporting, right, of when trans people are killed, but that doesn't cover the full extent of what's happening here. So globally this year, the number of trans people murdered rose from 330 to 350. And the stats show, this is an article from Forbes magazine, 1 in 4 of those people murdered were between the ages of 19 and 25, and 15 of them were youth under the age of 18. Very importantly, this research found that most of the victims were Black and migrant trans women of color and trans sex workers. So 9 out of 10, 93% of these reported murders were Black or brown trans people, which is a 14% increase from last year. And among the occupations of people murdered, sex workers were far and away the largest category. And And I think what those numbers show us is that the deepest roots of trans justice have to be inseparable from our understanding of racial justice. They have to be inseparable from our understanding of misogyny and misogynoir and ending poverty and ending imperialism. I think a strategy for trans justice that does not also fight on those fronts will continue to lose because, one, it'll continue to say that there are some of us who maybe, unfortunately, deserved what we got because we were too poor, we were too dark, we were too femme, or we were too far away from the seat of power to be worth protecting. But I also think that as long as we have that category of people who are not fully deserving of inclusion in our movements for justice, anybody can be put into that category, as long as it exists, as long as it's politically expedient for the powers and principalities of this world to do so. So we can have a movement, right, that absolutely includes and fights for the lives and dignity of, like, suburban white trans men in affluent blue counties. Yes, we can include those folks. It also, though, has to be a movement that is going to fight just as hard for young Black, brown, and indigenous trans women who are surviving on the streets in Houston, in the Bronx, in South Dakota, and at the border. And not only because that's what's right, but because it's in these places where we're going to find leaders who are already organizing in the face of apocalypse. That is the leadership that we need to meet this moment. When I think of the role of faith communities, people of faith, and of faith leaders, I think there are three important buckets of work for us in the years to come for trans justice. I think first is our public witness. This is a really important time to take seriously the battle for the Bible and publicly communicate that our theology clearly, strategically, and loudly enough to be heard over the deafening noise of white Christian nationalism, right? So white Christian nationalism has been so mainstreamed at this point that if you ask the average person on the street what Christianity is, they very well might just say something that sounds like white Christian nationalism. And white Christian nationalism is heresy. It's heresy. It's patently unbiblical. It's the idolatry of whiteness, wealth, power, and patriarchy. And it is the utter distortion of Scripture and the life and teachings and words of Jesus to serve those ends, to serve those false idols. So if we aren't able to communicate that in our pews, in our pulpits, and in the public square, I kind of don't know what we're doing in this moment. I think another critical piece of our public witness that is directly tied to that is our strategic, sustained mass engagement in these struggles that are happening at the local and state level. So turning our people out, our Bible studies out, our congregations out for school board meetings, for things that are happening in the State House, for anywhere where trans people are facing policy violence. I think the second important bucket for faith communities right now to be thinking of is our role as chaplains, as people who do ministry in times of crisis. Trans people and our families are in mass crisis right now, politically, psychologically, spiritually. We really need accompaniment and protection. We need that specifically in schools, in navigating the legal system, in accessing healthcare, and also as those crises, discrimination and violence continue to erupt in our workplaces and our neighborhoods and beyond, we need people who are walking with us, like in the concrete day-to-day ways, so that people know there are other sets of eyes on what happens to us. I think the third piece that's important for faith communities to be thinking of right now is sanctuary. It's really important to understand that people, trans people, and other groups of people who are feeling particularly vulnerable right now are making a lot of calculated decisions about relocating, maybe relocating to a different state, relocating to a different county where we're living in less fear of violence, less fear of discrimination. It's also important to keep in mind that is not feasible for the majority of us. Relocating is not an option for many, many people. Trans people specifically are disproportionately poor. We're disproportionately disabled. We're disproportionately impacted by the legal system. And those factors really severely limit our ability to relocate, particularly in rural areas, but not exclusively. LGBTQ plus affirming congregations they're some of the only spaces that are accessible for trans people to gather socially, to build community, and to organize for our safety and health. And while this piece is contested, faith communities do have a unique, valuable standing when it comes to leveraging sanctuary status. So it's not 100% bulletproof, not legally, not socially, but it is very strong. And it can still serve as a really important buffer from state surveillance, from repressive legislation, and from social violence. So when we open up the doors of our faith communities, like you all have done, for our faith communities to shelter and protect trans justice organizing work, that's a really critical contribution for years to come. And then, I'm a little bit over, I'm sorry, Peter. The last couple of things I want to say is, this is specifically for trans people, but it's okay for everybody to listen in. I've been rereading Ephesians 6, verses 10 through 20 a lot since Election Day. And I won't read the whole thing here, but it's that passage about putting on the full armor of God, right? So that you can stand when the day of evil comes. You can do everything that is possible for you to do and then continue to stand even after that. And there's a line in that passage that says, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. Not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, and against the spiritual forces of wickedness in high places. And when I read the verse that says, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, I think that means three important things for trans and non-binary people right now. And the first one is that our humanity is not the problem. Our own vulnerable human bodies are not to blame for the violence that is being done against us. And I know how easy it is for us to blame ourselves for how we respond to every threat and every blow that lands on us, how easy it is for us to feel ashamed of our bodies, of the things we know to be true of our own existence. And so if you have been feeling that way, if you have been feeling a little bit too afraid or ashamed to swagger, to shine just as brightly and fabulously as God made you, I just want you to look up right now. I want you to lift up your chin and straighten your back a little bit and take a deep breath in and let it out. And then you just be ready to take up 3 inches more of physical space in every room you walk into from here on out, because we're not going anywhere. We're not going anywhere. Let these powers and principalities try it. Let them find out what happens when they try to legislate the divine revelation of God out of us. The Bible has something to say about that. Something happened to Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea. I think what I hear when I read the Bible is that God only tolerates the brutality of empires for so long. This empire will reap what it has sown, and it might be a long journey, but in all of that, we have one job. We have one job, which is to remain free and to honor the revelation of God inside ourselves, inside our bodies, and inside our souls. We are not the problem. Our flesh and blood are not the problem. Thank you for having me with you.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for speaking so clearly into the present moment. We have some time for questions. If you're here in the room, Sally Sockwell has question cards. Just raise your hand. She'll come around to you, and you can fill those out, and she'll bring them up here. If you're joining us online, you can type your questions into the live chat on YouTube, the comments on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org, pthompson @stbarts.org. Email also works if you're here in the room. While we're waiting for the questions to come in, Aaron, you spoke about the importance of churches standing with trans and non-binary folks. In the description you wrote for this session, you used the term trans-affirming church. Can you talk about what it means to be a trans-affirming church? What steps, small and large, can St. Bart's take to be a trans-affirming church?
So I don't know St. Bart's well enough to know where you're at, but I do know that for every congregation in our church, church-wide, like, there's always more to do. Nobody's winning yet. Like, that's not how it works. That's not the goal. The goal is to just, like, live and serve people and the image of God and people more fully, and there's always more you can do on that. I think some of the most concrete things are thinking about physical accessibility of your space, and that includes so many things, and specifically for trans and non-binary people, that includes bathroom access. So what is the signage like for your restrooms? Have you thought through that part of your hospitality and your accessibility? What is the language that's going to greet people at the front door? So maybe you hung a pride flag or like a trans pride flag, and you're like, we put the flag here. Then people come because they saw the flag. Are they ready to step in? Has your congregation had some of the basic education around hospitality and good manners that is inclusive? So if you have name tags at your church, is there room for pronouns on those name tags? You don't have to go print 400 new name tags if you're worried about that. Like, you can get little stickers and put them on. You can get little magnets. You can even just write them in. That's a way, like, just a really low budget, low key way of communicating to folks who come through the doors. Like, we have thought about this, and we are not expecting you to do all the thinking about this. I think, it's interesting. The research shows that while trans people have been so harmed by spiritual abuse, by faith communities, by bad religion, bad theology, we remain, we self-report twice as high the level of spirituality and the importance of spirituality in our lives. And so some of us keep coming back. I think having a space where you're thinking about everybody who comes through your doors, like, as a person, right? Not a project, not a charity case, like, as a person who is capable of leadership and ministry, as bringing specific gifts with them as well as specific struggles, is really, really important. And I think it never hurts to do a little bit of wrestling with the theology and the scriptural interpretation that we have inherited, that we assume is anti-trans, right? Or that we assume is, supportive of what White Christian Nationalism says about sexuality and gender identity. There's actually a lot in Scripture that is explicitly affirming of third gender people. And so spending time on that, I think, is really valuable. Yeah.
In terms of the politics of the moment, we've been having discussions here at St. Bart's about what it means to be political but not partisan.
Yeah.
Some of that is dictated by what the IRS tells us. You
Exactly.
can't support candidates. You can take a stand on issues. And yet, an issue like trans rights has become so partisanized. How is there a way to talk about trans justice that isn't affected so much by the partisan politics of the moment? And is that even a laudable goal?
I think it is a laudable goal, and I think you can do it. I think it's very shaped by where you're having the conversation and who you're having it with. You're not going to win everybody, that's for sure. But when we look at this moment, for me, the gift of the church being forced to be nonpartisan is that we have to look at facts like, we can look at the popular vote, and we can like make assumptions on why people did what they did there. And then we just like have to look at the fact that that's not actually the majority of the country, because so many people are still so checked out from the political process that there's an enormous number of people, regular people, mostly hurting people, who are not engaged. And so we can do some of this like, counter recruitment work. I think that's important. But then there's just all these people who have not been brought into something. And if we can, my organizing background is organizing with folks in that position, right, who are struggling so much and have such profound disconnection and experiences of abuse at the hands of local government, that they're like, what is my dog in that fight? Like, I just want to stay out of that. And so if we can find ways to be building relationships at the bottom with everybody who is being hurt, you can go from that, from showing up for people in their day-to-day lives in material ways, whether that's through meal programs or harm reduction or jail outreach or whatever. Like, you can build from relationships. You can do just about anything. When people trust you, you can have conversations about the hard stuff and to struggle together. And eventually you can get to a place where it's very clear that the same people who are throwing trans kids to the wolves are also gutting healthcare, are pushing to defund public schools, are leaving vast swaths of the country, particularly where poor people live, up for grabs for ecological devastation at the hands of big corporations. So I think it's a long struggle, but I think weaving in our understanding of trans justice into this big picture about who deserves life and dignity, and taking seriously just how many people have been so left out of that across party lines is kind of our only angle on that front.
You've spoken on intersectionality, and you yourself have worked on both trans issues, gender issues, and economic issues. There are some in this moment who are saying we need to focus less on the social issues so we can focus on issues of economic justice. I'm assuming you think that's a false dichotomy. Can you reflect on that a little bit?
Yeah, I do think that is I know that is a false dichotomy. I know in my body that is a false dichotomy. I know in my entire life that I have, for the majority of my life, been a poor trans person. And I know what our people live with. I know that you can't separate people from the material conditions of their life. And if we try to do politics that way, we're going to keep losing. Like, people exist in the economy. People exist in their neighborhoods. People exist in their workplaces or lack thereof. And we can actually do and have to do both at the same time. And I think this is tied to what my last response was, is that this is how we're actually going to pick the most people up if we say and take seriously, we're coming for everybody. We're coming for everybody's right to live and thrive, and we're coming to defend that for every single person. There's no reason this richest country in the world, in the history of the world, has almost half of our people living in poverty. If you measure poverty not by the federal poverty level, but by like who cannot afford a $400 emergency, which is almost half the country. There's a lot of trans people in those numbers. There's also a lot of hurt people in general in those numbers, and I think it's about how you help people understand that as long as there's a scapegoat, the scapegoat could become them. and we're not here to do that. We're here to build, like the Jesus movement, a movement at the bottom, uniting poor and dispossessed and hurt people across all lines of difference to upend the order of this empire.
So we still have some time for questions. Again, if you're in the room, raise your hand and Sally will come around, or you can submit them online, pthompson@stbarts.org. This question kind of goes to what we were just talking about. How do we talk about ourselves as a community in a way that includes trans people as part of us?
Specifically as a church?
I think so. I think that it's a submitted question, but I think that's the idea.
Yeah. I think that's, if it's a church question, it's a really theological question, and it means, we talk about Jesus from the Bible. We talk about the prophets. We talk about Jesus' mom. We should keep talking about all of them. And we can also lift up other people. We can lift up the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8. We can lift up what Isaiah says about to the eunuchs of my house who keep my commandments. I'll give you a name more important than sons and daughters, an everlasting name. We can talk about, the book of Esther, I think, has it doesn't just have the most third gender people in it, but they all have names. It's 10 third gender people with names in the book of Esther. And so some of it is about getting familiar with that reality of our faith lineage. And some of it is about in our statements of welcome, we're an inclusive parish. We say explicitly that includes trans people, because if you don't say that explicitly, for good reasons, people are going to assume otherwise. It's in a lot of little details, and it's also about beyond what we say, beyond who we say we are. It's about where we show up. So, if your church turns people out to speak nonpartisanly but faithfully to the issues at a city council meeting, a school board meeting, the state legislature, that is maybe the best evangelism you could possibly do. Not just so that people show up and sit in your church, but so that people understand who we believe God to be. That, I think, moves people maybe more than anything we could say in-house is to see our public witness, and then to also have the experience when they show up here of being cared for and held.
I wonder if the questioner was also making the point that sometimes it's an us versus them, and we always assume that the trans non-binary people are outside, but they're also inside here as well, sometimes in visible ways, sometimes in ways that aren't visible.
Yeah. It's probably best to act like there are trans and gender nonconforming people in your congregation, even if you don't know that, because just because you don't know it, all that means is that nobody told you, and maybe because they didn't feel safe to tell you, or maybe because they just didn't feel safe in the church to do that. And so speaking from that perspective of this is already us. We're not going out to gather all the lost souls of trans people. We're everywhere. And so I think moving from that position and saying we already have these spiritual leaders, we already have these lay ministers, we already have these gifted people created in the image of God among us. It's not about going out and collecting all four or something like that.
You were reflecting on some scriptural resources in today's talk. I wonder, in terms of the theology that we proclaim and the way in which we do say our liturgy, some of us were having a little conversation about inclusive language beforehand. How should trans-informed theology change the theology of the church and the practice of the church?
There's a lot we could do with inclusive language in our liturgies. There's a lot we could do.
We say this before our Rite One liturgy at 11 a.m. this morning.
I'll say no more on that particularly. I think I'm a Bible scholar, so I always go back to the text, and I think looking at Genesis, right? Looking at the God of creation, and what we have this idea about like this is the start of it, right? It says male and female, God created them, and God was a he, and that's a interpretation. There's actually two accounts of creation, but also a long ancient lineage, particularly within Judaism, but not exclusively, that says like male and female God created them means like within the same body, with one body encompassing the entirety of God's gendered revelation. We had, I run a program, a weekly program, Monday night, 7 p.m., called the Gender Justice Jam on Zoom. You can find it on the Episcopal Church website. We just had a presentation from Reverend Alba Onofrio of Soul Force, and who was talking about like that text in particular, and like all these particularly gender bending ways the Bible tells us about God, like God as a she bear, God as a mother hen, like God as both male and female, and beyond all of that. I think we could inject more of that into our liturgies.
All right. A particular hot button political issue right now is girls' sports and trans participation in girls' and women's sports. Why do you think that's such a hot button issue, and what's the kind of response that puts us on the side of trans and non-binary people?
Yeah, I think this is a really time-tested, effective means of scapegoating people, is to turn people who are actually quite vulnerable, to distort the reality of that situation and to say these people are the predators. It is a distortion of what young trans girls and young trans women are dealing with. Like there's just an enormous amount of discrimination and violence that they risk. And white Christian nationalism in this moment is taking that reality and completely inverting it and passing legislation. This isn't specific to the sports, but I forget which state, it might have been Oklahoma, has now passed this anti-trans legislation that I believe it's about restricting literature about trans people in schools, and it's called the Millstone Act, and it's called the Millstone Act because it's about they're referencing that passage where Jesus says, if anybody lays a hand on these little ones or like gets in the way of children, basically a millstone should be hung around their necks. And so it's this really horrific distortion of a text to justify violence and stoke violent rhetoric and also violent action toward vulnerable people. I think for us, standing on the side of trans justice with regard to, access to sports participation for trans people, specifically trans girls, we have to speak continually about what is real, what is the reality that people are facing, who is actually perpetuating violence. It is not these kids. These kids are trying to be kids. They're trying to have full and equal access to the same health and thriving that all children have. And theologically, I would just say that when Jesus talks about the children, and then there's the passage that's suffer the little children to come unto me, he says that in Matthew 19. It's right after he says there are third gender people who have been that way from birth. There are third gender people who have been made that way by others, and there are third gender people, eunuchs, who choose to live this way for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. That passage is immediately followed by people in the crowd hearing that and saying, oh, this is the guy we want to bless our children. This is who we're going to bring them to. And I just think we should hold that in this moment and think about why those families thought that was the message for their children, that was the person who should bless their children, and how can we replicate that kind of blessing?
Of course, it would be nice if we read the passage about eunuchs in the kingdom of heaven in church. It's not in our lectionary, so we can't interpret it.
Yeah, it's good for Bible study, though.
We're coming close to the end of our time. I wonder if you can talk about your book coming out in January, what we should look for in it.
Oh, sure. So I have a book coming out. It's Bring Back Your People, 10 Ways Regular Folks Can Put a Dent in White Christian Nationalism. And it's not academic. It's funny. There's probably too many swears in it to read at a church book group, but maybe not, depending on your church.
We could handle it, I'm sure.
Yeah. See? Thank you. And it's just meant to be like understanding in this moment, folks have landed where they have landed politically, and that is not an accident, that there is something that white Christian nationalism, one way or another, whether it was on TV, some nonsense somebody heard from Tucker Carlson, or whether it was like a church that somebody started going to that was actually really there for them in a time of crisis, like some of them brought people through the front door one way or another. Real people. Pretty regular people with regular struggles. So this isn't like a counter-recruitment guide for people at the top. This is like counter-recruitment from just very average people who don't have much political power on their own. How do you have conversations that actually speak both to maybe the real struggles and pain that those folks are experiencing, while also bringing people into an awareness that other people are struggling, and here is what it is going to take for all of us to be okay. A lot of it is based on my work at Chaplains on the Harbor, just so a lot of like concrete stories out there, and the emphasis is really on building relationships first. Building relationships before you can actually do anything. Like, we're not going to get anywhere if we're just talking at people, or if we're just talking heads and we're saying like, you're bad, you're wrong, you did this wrong, you're hurting everybody. Most people are not actually out here trying to be reckless with other people's lives and have a limited amount of time for political education. So if we want to do something to counter that, we got to be effective and we got to be relevant in their day-to-day lives. So it's mostly about that stuff.
Finally, we do have to stop, but I wonder if you can talk about your role as staff officer for gender justice. You mentioned gender justice jams. What's the work going on denomination-wide that we should know about?
So still new, still building the plane while you fly it, and half the plane is on fire right now. But all good. I'm still in the stage of like getting to know people, letting dioceses and congregations know this office exists and exists to support the ministry you are doing or seek to do. So I field all kinds of, right now I still field like a lot of really random things, which I love. A lot of parish administrators who are like, I need to change the registry so that it is affirming and inclusive. It says bridegroom everywhere. I went through and I whited the entire thing out so people can handwrite it. I get a lot of messages like that. But looking forward in the next year, I'm aiming to do training programs at the diocesan level. So for folks who may be diocesan staff, but also just folks who are involved in ministry diocese-wide who can replicate that training in their diocese, hoping to do that around chaplaincy with trans people in this moment in particular. And the Gender Justice Jam will continue through December 16th, so you can join that. It's free, it's on Zoom, 7 p.m. I'm looking forward to building partnerships also with some of our sister churches internationally. So through the Gender Justice Jam, we've made really good connections with the Diocese of Columbia, which is doing powerful work on this front, and also building relationships with the Anglican Episcopal Church in Brazil, which is doing really incredible trans justice ministry and gender justice at large. And I actually think like places where the fight is so acute are the places we need to be learning from right now, because people with very little resources and very deep faith and a lot of hostility have continued to do God's work for protecting all God's children. So some of that too, and then hopefully bringing it back and wash, rinse, repeat here in the United States.
Please join me in thanking Aaron Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the important work that you're doing and for being with us today. And thank you all for being with us today. Next week at the Forum, we'll be welcoming Matthew LaBanca, who is a playwright and actor who has his own one-person show downtown off-Broadway about being fired from a Roman Catholic school for being gay. So we'll be talking with him next week. The show is playing through December 8th, and we hope you'll be with us then. We hope you'll also stick around and join us for worship today at 11 a.m.